Okay, great. So thank you, Lucas, for the introduction. Also wanted to say thanks to the organizers. I really like the seminar series. I discovered it last year, and it's great to see, an entire seminar series devoted to immigration research. Okay, so the motivation for this paper is, starts with the observation that migrants around the world are often overeducated in their occupation relative to natives. And this is a common definition. This is the most common definition of occupational downgrading. It's the one that I use in this paper. And it's worth noting that this is especially true during, sudden push factor migration waves, or in extreme cases during forced displacement, because these migrants, among many reasons, they arrive to a new location without a plan for how to enter the labor market or with a job lined up beforehand. And forced displacement is also something that, as this audience knows, has become increasingly common. It's practically doubled over the past decade globally. And what this means is that if this trend continues, that this migrant downgrading upon arrival is a trend that we would expect to continue being very relevant, both for the well-being of migrants themselves, and there's a large body of work studying this, but also for their impacts on the host economy. And this is what I'm going to focus on today, is the second question, how does migrant occupational downgrading affect native economic outcomes? And there are two kind of factors that we might be most concerned about here. And the first is that downgrading will concentrate economic competition among a subgroup of workers, and in particular, a subgroup of workers who are lower income, and this can, then harm a more vulnerable group and potentially increase inequality. And the other is that this might forego increases in total output and productivity, which is often a benefit, which can be a large benefit of immigration, and that will be mitigated if migrants are working in a smaller set of occupations that are also less productive and that are a worse match given the migrants' skills and experience. Now, two factors that will determine the extent to which this happens that I highlight in my model are here. And so first of all, we care about imperfect substitutability between migrants and natives. And this is because, within an occupation, migrants often have unique skills, they complete unique tasks and work, unique jobs relative to natives within that occupation. And so what this can mean is that, downgrading may concentrate migrants into occupations where they are more substitutable with natives and thus put greater downward pressure on native wages. And that could happen, for example, if those jobs are more routine or less specialized. Now, we also care about substitutability across skill groups. And this will determine the extent to which native wage effects remain concentrated within an impacted group or spread across groups. So for example, if natives and impacted occupations kind of switch into less impacted occupations that are in different skill groups, then this will spread the wage effect across the skill distribution. At the end of the day, this will determine the distributional impact of downgrading for native wages. Now, I also want to highlight two characteristics of developing economies that are relevant given these factors I just discussed. And why am I jumping to this setting? Well, from a an external validity perspective, we care about the developing country context. About 85% of global refugees are hosted in a developing economy, and they have unique characteristics that can impact the effect of migrant downgrading on the native economy. And the first is potentially higher substitutability at the bottom of the skill distribution. And in particular, these economies tend to have large informal sectors. And informality can be characterized by no minimum wages, no regulations on hiring or firing, and no regulations on legal status either. And more generally, often developing economies at the bottom of the skill distribution are characterized by high transition rates. We often have workers moving in between informal wage employment and self-employment pretty quickly. And so all of these mean that migrants may be able to enter these jobs faster and put more, and be more substitutable with natives and thus put more downward pressure on native wages. Another thing is that the developing country setting, we have a lot of evidence from lower and middle income countries for lower substitutability across education groups, and in particular across those with and without completed secondary education. And this may be driven by the large socioeconomic gap in who completes secondary schooling in this setting. And so that'll mean downgrading into jobs worked by those who tend to not have completed secondary those wage effects will be very concentrated among that group. Okay. So the setting that I'm actually looking at in this paper is the mass migration of Venezuelans to Colombia. So between 2015 and 2019, almost 2 million Venezuelans went into neighboring Colombia. They were leaving a political and economic, humanitarian crisis back home. And despite having largely similar education as Colombian natives, migrants were disproportionately concentrated in occupations with less educated natives. And to give you a sense of what these are, the top 5 migrant occupations were street vendors, restaurant workers, construction workers, domestic servants, and shop owners. And many of these migrants have completed secondary and post-secondary schooling. In all cases, the average migrant education is higher than the average native education in each of these occupations. And there are a few other characteristics of the Colombian context I want to quickly highlight that are important. The first is that this was a large, sudden, and a push factor migration wave. And what this means is it mitigates the scope for endogenous timing of migration, which is helpful from an identification perspective, relative to a setting in which migrants choose when to migrate and also where to migrate over a much longer period of time, right? Because all of this is happening over only a few years. So it amounts to something close to a natural experiment. Also, Colombia is a middle-income developing country with a high informality rate. Many people still not completing secondary schooling. And so for the reasons I just discussed, this is a very important and relevant setting. It's worth noting that there's a very similar culture and language between Venezuelans and Colombians. And this, is a unique characteristic. It highlights, first of all, that downgrading can still happen in this setting without language barriers. And it means that all of the results that I showed today are going to be, isolated from the effects of language and cultural barriers. Now, we also have evidence from an existing body of work, including by people involved in the seminar series and who presented in this seminar series last year, that this immigration did have an impact on the native economy, in particular, not on the employment margin, but on the wage margin for native workers, and in particular for less educated natives. And so there's definitely a lot of discrepancy in the magnitude of the results that we're observing, but that overall pattern is quite robust across papers and specifications. And so that motivates using a model to disentangle the role of downgrading, occupational downgrading of migrants in explaining these unequal wage effects, which is what I'm focused on today. And finally, Colombia is unique in the quality of the labor market data that it has. And I think this is important to highlight because it means, in particular, I can see labor market outcomes for migrants and natives across space and over time. And that's quite unique, especially in the developing country setting, and that's necessary to estimate the model that I'm going to estimate. So what I do is I estimate a nested CES model of labor demand that allows for imperfect substitutability between migrants and natives and across native education groups. And this has been used to study the effects of immigration on wages in the upper income country setting. And so I apply it in this new setting, but in particular, what I do is I adapt it to incorporate occupational downgrading directly. And I do this using information on the migrants' observed occupation in Colombia. So in this sense, downgrading is going to shift competition down the education distribution, in my model. And I'll explain how I do this, in a bit. And what is the benefit of this? This allows me to think about a counterfactual in which I undo downgrading. And again, I'll talk about this more later, but what I essentially do is I reassign migrants to their actual education group and think about, and I observe, what are the predicted changes in the total wage effect of immigration over this period on natives, within different education groups under this reassignment. And what I find when I do this is that, the wages of less educated natives benefit a lot from, this reassignment, but I don't see decreases or large decreases in wages for more educated natives. And this is driven by 2 factors that the model highlights. The first is this higher complementarity in higher skilled jobs, right? Those jobs put less, immigration in those jobs puts less downward pressure on native wages. And second is that there are increases in total output driven by this reallocation that benefit everyone. So they increase everybody's marginal product, and that undoes the effects of greater competition for higher skilled workers. Now, lastly, I'll give you a quick preview of my identification strategy. Basically, I'm going to use variation in the migration rate across metropolitan areas and across years. And the research design is going to account for two key factors. The first is endogenous sorting of migrants into locations, which I'm sure everyone in this audience is very familiar with. So I'm going to use an instrumental variable strategy based on historical Venezuelan settlements. So it's very close to the standard shift share instrument adapted to this setting. And I'll argue that this is a uniquely appropriate setting to use this type of instrument. And I'll also pay attention to the spatial arbitrage of natives. If natives internally migrate in response to immigration from Venezuela, that could bias labor market estimates based on geographic variation. And so I actually, I'll measure the extent to which Venezuelan immigration impacted internal migration. I find that it led to small increases in outmigration and small and insignificant decreases in in-migration. But these effects aren't large, and I test robustness to this using the fact that I see the migration history for all of the natives in my sample as well. So I'm not going to talk about this more today unless I have more time, but I know this isn't driving a large bias in the results. So now I'm going to go into a quick review of the background of this migration wave, the extent to which we're seeing downgrading. Then I'll review the model and the data and get into the results and the counterfactual. So I'll do this very fast because I know, this has been presented here a few times. I feel like most people are probably familiar with the setting by this point. But I think the key points are that historically, Venezuela has been a relatively wealthy country in Latin America. So there was small outmigration, a small Venezuelan diaspora in different countries, but never any large spells about migration, never anything remotely close to what we're observing today. So what happened is that in 2014, oil prices collapsed, and at this point, the Venezuelan economy had a kind of a weak private sector, a lot of inefficiencies in the agricultural industry and in the oil industry, and these things combined, stimulated this recession that gradually increased in severity over the following years. So by 2016, they'd officially entered hyperinflation, and by 2018, independent estimates from within Venezuela, from universities in Caracas, had placed the poverty rate at around 90%. Right, so this has become a full-blown humanitarian crisis. You had people who were once middle income or upper middle income or even upper income who have lost their savings and who have been thrown into poverty. And so we have migration happening from across the education distribution within Venezuela. We also have evidence that around a third of the population was forced to skip meals. There was scarcity of essential medicines and healthcare, and an extremely high homicide rate. So people are leaving for all of these reasons. In general, a combination of many factors. And so by 2019, around 5 million Venezuelans had left, and that amounted to just over 15% of the country that left over this period. Now, Colombia received more than any other country, largely because they're located next to the majority of the Venezuelan population. So it was the first destination to go to. And the 2 million, almost 2 million that they received amounted to about 4% of the native population. So this was a very, very large migration wave, the largest flow between any two countries that we've observed in Latin America in centuries, and one of the largest in the world. Importantly, this is the first time there's been a large immigration to Colombia. So looking back to the 1993 census, less than a fraction of the population is foreign-born, and that doesn't really change until 2015. You have a small uptick in the Venezuelan born population, and that starts to increase much more in 2016. And by 2019, 95% of all foreigners in the country are Venezuelan. And there were no changes in migration from other countries to Colombia over this period. And it's important to note that most migrants did arrive after 2017, especially in 2018 and 2019 were the largest flows. So this, and my data is going to go up to 2019, so before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this really is a short run study of the economic effects of immigration. That being said, the model that I use can be used to predict the long run effects of immigration. If the downgrading that we're observing is doesn't change in the coming years, then we can predict how native wages will evolve as capital adjusts, for example. And finally, some quick notes on legal status, because I think it's important to cover that. There were some small requirements for documents to enter the country for most of this period, but migrants without documents would simply kind of pass irregularly around the border checkpoints. So you had basically free flow across the border. There were work permits offered to regular migrants starting in 2017, and this was expanded to a large registry of undocumented workers in 2018, with a few additional expansions in the years that followed. So this wasn't perfect coverage, but most migrants in Colombia did have legal status, access to legal status if they wanted. However, in practice, many remained undocumented. Just a ballpark estimate from the migration authorities is that about 40% were documented in 2019. And among those, some of them had access to legal status, or to work status, legal work permits. And yet around 90% remained in the informal sector in 2019. So that is the sector that's receiving the most migrants. And it's a very relevant sector in Colombia. It's about half of the economy. And even among workers with a completed secondary, I think around 30% of them are informally employed, right? So this is relevant across the education distribution as well. Now, this is a histogram of the completed education for migrants and non-migrants in Colombia. And here migrants are anyone who arrived over the past 5 years, right? And this is looking specifically in 2019, just for this statistic. We can see that among those the education distribution of migrants is broadly similar to that of natives. They're a bit less likely to have any post-secondary, but still around over 20% have some post-secondary. So this is not a primarily low-skill migration wave. It's relatively representative of the Colombian distribution. Now, what's really relevant for my model is what is the change in labor supply within education group induced by immigration over this period. And so I'm going to do this among workers with completed education, and that'll become clear why in a second. And first, I'm just going to assign migrants using their observed education. So, using their actual education. And what I see is that it's, concentrated in the middle of the distribution. So about an 8% increase in the, labor supply for those with completed secondary, between 5 to 6% for the other two groups. Now, what I'm going to do is reassign them according to their occupation. And in particular, what I do is I look at the, native education distribution in their occupation and assign them using those probabilities. So, for example, if a college-educated migrant is working in a restaurant, as a restaurant worker, and 75% of natives, leading up to the immigration, who were restaurant workers had less than completed secondary, then 0.75 of that migrant essentially would be assigned to less than completed secondary. Or in the model, this is how I'm going to do it in the model as well. So this is important. They're assigned to that group with 75% probability. And so in this sense, we see how downgrading shifts where competition is occurring, and it's shifting it towards less than secondary and away from post-secondary quite severely. And then when I think about the no downgrading counterfactual, I'm essentially going to reassign them from the red bars back to the green bars. Now, one important assumption that this makes has to do with the comparability of the education systems. So if Venezuelan education is worth more or less than Colombian education, this might not be the best way to characterize downgrading based on education. But anecdotally, these education systems are broadly similar. Venezuelan education is known for being quite good in the public system, and in particular Venezuelan universities. But to get some more concrete evidence for this, I'll go over this pretty quickly for time, but I look at a 2009 PISA evaluation that ranks them pretty closely in terms of 15-year-olds, reading math and science outcomes. And then I'll also look at migrants from Venezuela and Colombia in the United States in the 2015 ECS who are educated at home. And I run a Mincer earnings regression, controlling for age and gender and time of arrival to estimate the returns to schooling for each group in the US. And I find that they're broadly similar. If anything, post-secondary returns are higher for Venezuelans. And I show some evidence that this doesn't seem to be driven by different patterns of migrant selection from each country. So we can talk about this more if you like afterwards, but I think if anything, Venezuelan education, before the crisis began was, a little bit better than Colombian, in which case any downgrading, in which case I'm essentially underestimating the extent of downgrading And the counterfactual is going to underestimate the true distributional benefits of undoing downgrading. So the model that I use is a labor demand function of 3 education groups and migrant native status. And the basic idea, which follows from from the labor economics literature, is that in equilibrium, under perfect competition, wages are going to respond to shifts in the supply curve. And so I'm thinking of the native labor supply is held fixed over this period, and as migrants arrives, that shifts the supply curve to the right, and wages kind of respond in equilibrium. Now, this is a standard assumption in this literature that native labor supply is fixed. I think in this setting, I can also motivate this by the fact that we know the wage margin is the more responsive margin in this case. Just we have lots of evidence that there don't seem to be large employment effects here. So in this setting, I think this is a more reasonable assumption. And if I don't put any restrictions on this system, I end up with a large number of cross elasticities. So the nested framework reduces this to something that's more manageable to estimate. And this is the nesting structure that I use. So first, labor supply is divided into those with any post-secondary and without any post-secondary, and that's group 3. And then among those without post-secondary, they're divided into groups 2 and 1, which is those with completed secondary and those without completed secondary. And then within each group, you have substitutability between migrants and natives that's allowed to vary by education group. And I estimate a more flexible production function that kind of motivates this nesting structure in the appendix. This is also the most common nesting structure that we typically see in the literature. So production is going to be CRS Cobb-Douglas. This is a representative production function. And there are 2 kind of key things here. The first is that capital is weakly separable here. So it's going to not play into any of it's going to be not in any of my estimating equations. And essentially, it's not going to change the returns for one group of labor relative to another. And the other is that there are diminishing returns in the labor aggregate here when capital is held fixed. And so in the counterfactual, I'm going to think about this in this setting, right? I'm going to think about, over this short run period, I'm going to hold capital fixed, and that's going to generate a negative wage effect in the aggregate determined by the scale of this labor parameter term, which I'll just take from the literature using the best estimates we have. But in particular, my model is going to be most informative about the distributional effects, right? That's what I'm really going to focus on, and that's not going to depend on as much on this labor share parameter. It will a bit, but not entirely. And those are also the effects that we would expect to persist in the long run, unless migrants upgrade. So sorry if I'm going to go over this kind of quickly, but labor is a CES composite following the standard. The nesting structure I just showed. This is the standard equation. So you have these productivity parameters alpha that are going to sum to 1 for migrants and natives, and the the education-specific substitutability term determines how native and migrant labor aggregate together. And then under competition, under perfect competition, wages are going to be a function of the marginal product of labor, which in particular, it becomes a function of labor supply, not just in one's own group, but across all groups as well. And this is really key because it means that migrants arriving to a different education group than your own can still impact your wages. You can benefit from increases in the total output that improve your marginal product, and the extent to which those complementarities kind of counteract the within group wage effects that you experience that are going to be negative if migrants and natives are substitutable will determine whether or not the overall effect for you is negative or positive. And then this should look familiar if you've seen if you've read these papers, in particular Ottaviano and Perry is the kind of most seminal one, that you can estimate this equation by basically taking the log ratio of migrant native wages. And you can you see then that it's the relationship between the labor supply ratio and the wage ratio determine the substitutability parameter. So that's how I'm going to estimate this across metro areas. Now, the dilemma here is that if we assign migrants using their observed education, that's essentially a misclassification problem. So I'm assigning them to a group within which they're actually not competing. They're competing instead with, say, lower educated workers. And so what I do is when I assign migrants to education groups, I use these probabilities based on the native distribution in their occupation to assign them. So that's how I'm going to think about downgrading in this setting. And I'll explain more formally exactly how I do that in the estimation. And Lucas, feel free to stop me if there's a good time to stop for questions. So the data that I'm using here is the Colombian Integrated Household Survey. So this is the labor force survey of Colombia. It's cross-sectional. This includes self-employed and informal workers, which is an important part of the economy, and I'm including them all together here. And as I said, this is linked to a migration module where I can see where someone was located 5 years ago and 1 year ago. And then I can compare the labor market outcomes for migrants and natives. So that's really key. And so I'm defining a migrant as anyone who was in Venezuela 5 years ago. Now, in Colombia, the first administrative division, the department, is quite large, and the second one, the municipality, is quite small. So what I do is I aggregate municipalities into metropolitan areas using a algorithm based on a commuting threshold, following a method from Durant in 2015. Now, there's a question here about the sample size, and this survey is not designed to be representative at this level. So I want to make sure that measurement error is not biasing my results here. So what I do first of all is restrict it to places that have a yearly sample of at least 300 observations. And I end up with 79 metro areas that account for about 80% of Colombians and 90% of migrants. So this is the majority of natives and migrants are captured here. But I can also, in a robustness check, restrict the number of metro areas to those that have a larger sample, of at least say 1,000 people per year. And this ends up being very similar to just using the officially defined administrative metropolitan areas in Colombia, of which the survey is officially representative, right? So these are defined according to additional considerations such as political considerations. So that's why I prefer not to use them in my main specification. But it turns out that you can do it either way and you get very similar results. So these are my 79 metro areas. And you can see that the migrant share varies quite a bit across them. In some metro areas, in particular, those close to the border, they're up, over 10% of the population is coming from Venezuela, but you still have lots of pockets further inland. You have large numbers of migrants in big cities like Bogota, which is here, and Medellin and Cartagena. So this variation is key. Like this is the geographic variation that I'm going to use to estimate this model, which is also a bit different from the framework that you've seen in papers like Ottaviano and Perry, since I am using geographic variation here. CARD 2009 does do something similar to this. So my sample are going to be workers age 15 to 64 with completed education. And I'm going to calculate everyone's log hourly earnings. And I'm going to residualize from gender and age bins, though this doesn't have a big effect on the results. And so this is my estimating equation based off of the one that I just showed you, where I have the wage ratio of migrants and natives, and I take the log, within an education group, a city, and a year T. And I'm going to estimate this separately by education group, and basically regress this on the labor supply ratio, across years and metro areas. And my years are from 2014 to 2019. And then I have metro area fixed effects that are going to capture those relative productivity parameters. So the relative productivity of migrants versus natives, really the relative wages that are going to be held fixed within metro area. So it's only changes in the relative outcomes that are going to drive this estimation. So anything that affects, any change in wages that affects migrants and natives equally is not going to factor into this. I also weight by sample size to downweight the small sample areas, and I fix the native population to the 2014 value. So as I said, I'm going to treat them as being held fixed. And then I'm skipping over this now for time, but in a subsequent step, I estimate analogous equations for the across education substitutability parameters. Now to do the occupational assignment that I've also hinted at already, I, within each migrant's occupation, calculate the share of natives working in each education group and randomly assign them to education groups with those weights. And then using that assignment, I estimate the model and I store the parameters, and I repeat this 100 times and I take the mean. And then standard errors are bootstrapped and clustered at the metro level. And so, you have to do this random assignment because, you also have the wages to worry about. So it's not just about, adjusting their labor supplies. When a migrant gets assigned to a group, their wage is going to drive estimation within that group as well. Now, there is a question about, the comparability of migrants within, an occupation, say, who are better and less educated. And if better educated migrants are more productive, maybe their, their labor supply is worth a bit more within that group. And so what I do is I just adjust their labor supply using, another Mincer earnings regression. So I'm looking at their education wage premium, within that occupation group, and I adjust their labor supply accordingly. So I'm sorry that, that was pretty quick, but let me know if you want to talk more about that at the end. It basically, it doesn't end up having a large effect because, what I see is that the returns to secondary and post-secondary schooling within a lower skill occupation are much smaller for migrants than they are for natives. So these adjustments aren't very large. And then lastly, before I show you the results, I do use an instrument to account for migrant sorting into metro areas according to the wage ratio. And so for this, I take a shift share instrument based on the 2005 census, adapted to the endogenous, to the functional form of the endogenous variable here. Because of time, I won't talk much more about this because it turns out I don't see, a difference between OLS and 2SLS. They're very similar. But I think, the fact that the migrant share in 2005 was very small, that there wasn't any immigration until 2015, subsequent immigration, and, it's largely uncorrelated with things that we see before the start of the migration means that this is a pretty strong candidate for.
You have 10 minutes, more or less, okay?
10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. That's perfect. And if there are questions, you can interrupt me now. Okay, so and sorry, I skipped over the IV quickly. But so these are the substitutability parameters that I find for those with less than secondary, with completed secondary, and with post-secondary. And first of all, as I said, OLS and 2SLS are pretty similar here. Now, the first result is that I find that less educated natives are more substitutable with migrants. And as I said at the beginning, this could be because the jobs completed in those occupations are more routine or they're less specialized, right? So there's less room for the complementarity driven by natives' unique skills acquired migrants' unique skills acquired back home. It could also be related to the informal sector, and I don't think I really have time to present this part here, but I find some suggested evidence that substitutability is higher in the informal sector. And I do this basically by dividing the labor market into the formal and informal jobs. And there's a question about natives sorting in and out of the informal sector that I try to account for with a two-step sorting style thing. And the confidence intervals are also large. So that's why I think this is kind of suggestive. I think this is a great area for future work, is to try to understand better, the mechanisms of competition in this setting when you have informality and also a lot of self-employment. So in terms of the magnitudes that I find, the substitutability between migrants and natives with post-secondary education is about 6.5, which is comparable with what we see, for example, with high-skill migrants in the UK over the short run. So I think this is, relatively comparable with the literature. What seems larger to me are the lower education group substitutability parameters. There are about 13 and 15 for those without completed secondary. Now these are, I would say, large for short run estimates, because if we look at the long run substitutability between migrants and natives in the US, it's around 18 to 20. And so the fact that we're observing parameters kind of close to that already after only a few years implies to me that they're being pretty substitutable quite quickly. But I think we need more. There isn't a huge literature to work from across different countries. So with more work, we'd be able to compare this with more countries a bit better. The only robustness check I'll talk about now is this last one. So there's a concern about the changing composition of migrants over this period. If migrants arriving later have different characteristics, that means their wages are different, not because of labor market factors related to the labor market in Colombia, but because of their underlying skill. And so what I can do is I can, when I estimate this, drop the wages of migrants who arrived in the past year, only use the wages of those who arrived between 1 and 5 years ago. It is kind of an extreme check because it drops a lot of the sample. The standard errors go up a lot. But if anything, the parameters just become larger, and the pattern that I observe is towards more substitutability, and I observe a similar pattern across education groups. So I don't think that's something that's explaining my results, at least, though the standard errors here are pretty large. And then in terms of across education substitutability, first I didn't show you this estimating equation, but the intuition is the same. It's the ratio of the labor supply of those in each education group and the wage ratio that drive these parameters. And remember, I'm holding the native labor supply fixed. So this is driven by migrants arriving to a location and working in an occupation that tends to employ natives in that education group. And so what's interesting, I think, is despite the fact that the standard errors are kind of large also on these, so they're not super precise, but the results are pretty consistent with what we see in the literature in Colombia and in Latin America. So I think it's interesting that they're very consistent, despite estimating them via a very different method. So that kind of builds some confidence in the entire exercise, I think. And finally, the substitutability between those with and without completed secondary, which is this group here, the sigma 2 parameter, is much smaller, as we know from the literature in Latin America, than we tend to observe in, say, the US or the UK. And so this will amplify the consequences of downgrading for that less educated group. So now the predicted, total effects of immigration on native wages over this period. And I do this just by plugging these changes in labor supplies into the model with the estimated parameters. And then I set the labor share equal to a value that is, the best guess that I have based on the literature. It was relatively stable over this period. But changes in this are only going to impact the total scale of the wage effect, not so much the distributional consequence. And so remember, this means that the labor aggregate is going, increases in the labor aggregate are going to cause a decrease in wages because of this. And these changes in the labor supply effects are the red bars that I showed you before. So this is under downgrading using the assignment that I used to estimate the model. And we see that the wage effect is about -4% for those without completed secondary, around -3.4% for those with completed secondary, and closer to 0 for those with post-secondary. So we see this pattern of stronger negative wage effect for less educated natives that loosely match up with the more kind of reduced form approach we have in other papers. And the question is, absent downgrading, will the wage effect simply shift to groups 2 and 3? And when I kind of reallocate migrants to their observed education, what I see is that first the labor supply shifts to the green bars that I showed you before. And the wage effect for those without completed secondary is mitigated by about 1 percentage point. So it's mitigated as expected. But interestingly, it doesn't change. If anything, it becomes a bit better also for those with completed secondary, and the decrease for those with any post-secondary is quite small relative to the increase in labor supply they experienced. And that's despite having a large increase in the labor supply shock for those with completed secondary. So the result of this is that if you weight these changes by the population within each group, you do see a 10% reduction in the average wage effect, when weighted by population shares. And there are 2 reasons for this that I've highlighted. One is the greater complementarity in those higher skilled jobs, and the other are these this low substitutability across education groups, which really drives the strong benefits in total output and total productivity. Because when you have low substitutability across groups, a reallocation that makes the change in labor supply more balanced will increase total output quite a bit. And we also have that those groups have, those education groups have higher alpha terms, higher productivity parameters. So just to conclude, reducing occupational downgrading benefits less educated natives without harming more educated natives. And this was driven by that high substitutability in low skill groups and the low substitutability across groups. And both of these are characteristics, potentially characteristics of developing countries, where we also know that forced migration, anything approaching forced migration is most prevalent. And those are settings where we expect downgrading to be very relevant. So I think an important area for future work might be, at least for me, estimating this model in other settings as well, and exploring how these, these substitutability parameters kind of vary across contexts and determine the consequences of downgrading. there's an important policy question that I've kind of neglected to discuss in this entire talk, which is, why are Venezuelans concentrated in low-skill occupations and in the informal sector? Everything I did was conditional on downgrading, but we would like to know, why is this downgrading happening? That's also a really important area for future work that I know, many people are working on. The interesting thing about this setting is we know it's not language and cultural barriers. At least not, there are no large language barriers. If any, there might be very small ones. And it's not access to work permits for most people, right? There still is gap in who has access to them. There's still uncertainty over legal status and return plans that, could make it harder for, that make employers less likely to hire migrants, even when they have, some sort of work status. There are issues with occupational licensing and education recognition, and also discrimination that are probably very relevant here. So that's important for us to understand these factors better in this setting to be able to, to mitigate these consequences of downgrading. So I hope timing was okay there. That's all I have. So you can open it up for questions.
Hey, Jeremy, thank you for the nice presentation. The time was perfect, and so let's open the mic for everyone that is interested to ask something. Just remember, you can raise your hand or just state in the Q&A if you have any question. I think there's no questions. I can start. I have like just two small questions. The first one is the policy implications. So you state that, of course, reducing migrant occupational downgrading could be beneficial, but then how do you do it? Like in Colombia has been an open policy government, like giving work permits, and that's, I think, most of the government can do in this case, and you see that even the occupational downgrading is present. So how do you do it in this type of context? That's the first question. And the second one is more methodological, and is you state that you take all the immigrants from Venezuela when you take the migrants, the stock. But I was wondering, like, you take the Venezuelans born and also the returning Colombians. So for your nested CES framework, returning Colombians and Venezuelan born migrants are perfect substitutes or not? And that's the two questions.
Yeah, I can start with the methodological one. So yeah, that's true. I'm including both, many of for those who aren't familiar, migrants coming from Venezuela were actually born in Colombia or descended from Colombian immigrants in Venezuela and returning. I think it's about 20% of the migration wave. And yeah, I'm grouping them together. So I'm implicitly assuming that they have perfect substitutability between them, which of course is an assumption. It might not be true. It's probably not true. I could try to adapt the model to incorporate it. I think this challenge there for me is the small sample size of like return migrants among all migrants. But the reason that I'm including them together rather than, say I could just exclude the return migrants entirely, but I think that's something that I don't want to do because, those migrants are going to similar places as the Venezuelan born migrants, and they also have an impact on the, the native economy. So for me, it's better to assume that they're the same as the Venezuelan born migrants than to assume that they have no effect on the native economy, which would just amount to, an omitted variable bias. Another approach could be to try to control for the, return migrant share, but because it's so closely correlated with the Venezuelan born share, you just have trouble like separating the effects of the two groups. And I'm not saying it's impossible to do, just in my experience, it's been challenging to disentangle their effects. And then and let me know if you have more questions about that. And on the first point, I completely agree. That's, a very important question. I think, going forward, an important part of that literature is going to be evaluating programs. There are all of these initiatives starting to try to, whether it's like in Brazil, for example, moving migrants into locations where there are more job availabilities, or, programs to, train migrants and match them to job vacancies if they lack networks with employers, or just the, the large legal status, reforms that have happened in Colombia that are being rolled out right now. All of these I think are important to study to better understand, what is the best way to do this. that's definitely, I completely agree. That's like the golden question that I'm not really answering with this paper.
Okay, thank you. There's a question by Diego Marino, so I'm gonna unmute him and then you can speak, Diego. 1 second. I think Lucas, you should do it because, yeah.
I've done it. So Diego,
Hello?
normally, yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Hi, Jeremy.
Hey,
Nice
Diego.
to see your presentation. It was a really nice talk.
Thanks.
I had a question for you. You at some point you said that this was a special case for your instrument about the immigrants that were previously settled in Colombia, but then maybe I missed this bit. But can you explain more of why it was a special setting, or like how this could I don't know, can you talk about why the instrument is good in this case?
Yeah. So what I said is that I think this is a uniquely appropriate setting to use the shift share based on historical migration settlements, which, there's been a lot of literature questioning when, this should and shouldn't be used. So I can kind of quickly clarify that I'm still assuming that the timing of migration is exogenous, right? And that's not, the main point that I'm making here is this assumption about the historical share not being endogenous to economic trends over this period. And one concern is that the migrant share in 2005, places that had more migrants, their economy evolved differently because of the lagged effects of that group on the economy. But the share was very, very small in 2005. It was like less than 1% of the population, even in the most Venezuelan heavy metro areas. There's also this question about subsequent immigration between when the migrant shares are measured and the current migration wave that could be driving effects. And we saw in the graph, it was very, very, very low and then jumped up suddenly in 2016. So that's also not a concern here. I think the biggest concern is really, just are the places that migrants went in 2005, were those places different for whatever reason that's correlated with economic trends? So for that, we do the standard checks and I look at the, pre-period economic outcomes in those locations and the pre-trends for native wages. I can't do it for migrant wages because there aren't enough migrants in the pre-period. And I mean, they look kind of flat. So it's not saying the instrument is perfect. It's saying this. I think this is a uniquely appropriate setting for using.
That's
Does that help?
So the timing is good. I was just wondering about like the specific location, if you had something to say about that, but probably it's like networks and stuff, right? Like family ties or.
Yeah, and that brings up another good point about local average treatment effects. That maybe migrants, driven by the instrument, the marginal migrant is more likely to have networks because they're going to places with networks, and that is somehow related to the substitutability parameters. I mean, I also find the fact that I find such similar estimates across groups would have to imply that the true average treatment effect is somewhere else, and the local average treatment effect just happens to be the same as the OLS. So, it would have to fit a specific pattern like that.
That's great. All right. Thank you. It was a great talk again. Let's catch up sometime.
Yeah, sounds good.
See ya.
Okay, so we have another question by Eugene Wong. So I don't know if you want to ask it or I should do it. Eugene, I can try to unmute yourself if you want. You can talk if you want. If not,
hi, hello.
Hi,
Jimmy. Great work, great job. So my question is kind of related to a more general equilibrium insights of this study. So I understand that you generally look at the wage market, labor market, and I'm wondering what's going on, or what it would change your results if we take into the migration location choice of the immigrants into take with we take that into consideration, what will happen? I'll be interested to knowing that, because maybe some people like some region because of the amenity and housing price, rents, they play a crucial roles for determining where people want to locate, right? And those definitely interact with the labor market, right? So
yeah, no, that's an excellent question. So I guess in this model, I'm kind of, I'm not modeling the migrant location decision, right? I'm an instrument for it. So it's, I'm getting like the first, the partial equilibrium side of this model, where, when you're predicting the effects of, say, changing occupational downgrading, wages change in equilibrium, and then maybe where migrants choose to live changes in equilibrium, and that also has effects on the aggregate, effects. So yeah, that's something I need to think about more. There would have to be like important regional patterns that are, that migrants are responding to, that are then affecting the average effects that we observe, because everything I presented is about the average effect.
I'm thinking, what I'm thinking is exactly, so if you have some data you can measure that how immigrants inflow can impact the geographic distribution of native location or something like that. It would be great to speak to that, my question, right?
Okay, so I see. So you're also thinking about native location choice, not just migrants.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I do. So, I can actually show that the immigration did cause, a small change in native internal migration patterns. But it's not very large. It's something like a 0.1 percentage point change in like the regular flow out of the city from a 1% increase in the migrant share. I have to double check.
I see, makes sense. So I guess my point.
So yeah, that's relevant too. Like you could have a model where both migrants and natives are choosing where to live. Someone who is good at spatial equilibrium stuff should do that. I think this would be an interesting setting for something like that. If you can accurately measure those migration patterns, and if they end up being large enough to have something meaningful emerge from the results.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure if you can do something like this, your paper will be really fascinating and to be really be attractive to macro folks, urban folks.
Yeah, maybe in future work. Of course,
cool.
there are other ways I could extend this model too. For example, I could actually model the sorting of natives into occupations and do this by occupation group instead of education group. But that would be like an occupational sorting model. So I think there are various ways you can motivate extending it. What I've done so far is a bit more, I like it in that it's a bit simpler, right? I don't have to make big assumptions about what drives the sorting decision either across occupations or locations. So that's one benefit I would say of this framework.
I see. Yeah, if you're interested in that, I think there's a recent paper on Restat. I posted the link here. Maybe you can, you want to go and check it.
Okay, thanks.
They study the general equilibrium effect of the Mexico to US migrations, immigrants.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene. So we have another question of Cesar Barreto, so you can talk now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, hi, Jeremy. Well, thank you very much for the very nice presentation. This is really interesting work. So I have one question regarding your models. So maybe I missed it, but does your model also account for potential native labor supply response to the migration flow?
Yeah, so that's something, I assume the native labor supply is held fixed. So I don't account for it.
Okay.
That's another thing that could be kind of incorporated into a more general equilibrium type framework. But I motivated that by saying that in the existing evidence that we have of just the like the reduced form effects of migrants arriving, using an instrument also, so non-structural estimates, we see changes in native wages in response, but not on the employment margin. So we at least know, there aren't large employment responses to this.
Oh, okay, great. I was just wondering because you're estimating at the city level, so I thought well, maybe this could be an issue, but yeah, sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, it could be an issue, but I don't think it's, you know, a massive issue.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
There is also a question by Felix Stips, and he's asking if you could also include experience and or age nest in the SES framework.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. I actually do that in like an appendix section where I like add age and gender groups into the kind of nesting structure. The reason I took it out of this, you know, what I presented today is because, you know, the education specific effects don't change very much when you do that. And those I really wanted to highlight, and it added a lot of kind of uncertainty in the estimation because your sample size is getting, you know, smaller and smaller and smaller when you do that division. But I think you know, there are some interesting patterns in which you have, you know, younger Venezuelan migrants competing with older native workers, especially kind of with less education. And so when you know, if you're going to reassign migrants also to their, you know, actual age group, then it also kind of it lessens the wage effect for older workers and shifts it a bit more to younger workers. So there are some dynamics like that going on.
Okay, so I think there are no more questions. So I think Lucas can just give the last brief final of the seminar. Thank you to everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Lucas. So for those who want to stay, we'll stay a bit longer. Jeremy has a bit of time to follow up on the discussion. So, I mean, for the participants who want to stay, you can